All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Japanese cinema panel here at Anime Detour. My name is Mark McPherson. I'm a local film critic for TwinCitiesGeek.com, as well as movieswithmark.com and filminquiry.com. So I watched quite a few films, and on this stream, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of my favorite and kind of weird Japanese films that I so love to appreciate and always love to talk about. So when we talk about like Japanese film, like one of the first big ones that everyone loves to talk about, mainly because his films are cited in so much material, is Akira Kurosawa. Now, Kurosawa's work has been some of the most inspirational films ever made. And one of his first big ones to kind of like reach a bigger audience was Rashomon. Now, to be fair, yes, Akira Kurosawa has done a few films before this, a lot of comedies and a lot of some dramas before that. But Rashomon was kind of like his first big kind of like Japanese historical epic that really took off for his career. And it's odd because like it seemed like it was going to be like the end of his career. That's he thought it was going to be the end of his career. So Rashomon, for those who are not familiar with, it's a story basically where it's the story of like a murdered samurai who's speaking through a Shinto psychic. There's a bandit in the forest. There's a monk. There's the rape of a wife, and there's a dishonest retelling of the events as people try to figure out just what went down with this incident that involved rape and murder. And you get these different perspectives from everybody they talk about with this story, and you basically have to question who is telling the truth when everyone is telling so many different stories about it. It's based on a classic short story called In a Grove, and it's become like it became more widely recognized. Like it was initially thought that Kurosawa, when Rashomon didn't do that well in Japan, he figured, my career's over. Maybe international audiences will like it. And sure enough, once they did that, it really took off abroad, and a lot of people started to take notice of Kurosawa's work. Rashomon has often been cited in many examples of storytelling, basically any storytelling that involves a retelling of events. People will know this is a fairly common storytelling device for a lot of TV shows that will want to talk about an incident after the fact. In fact, there's an entire television series that just adopts like the Rashomon format. There's a show called Grounded for Life, in which we catch up with a bunch of characters after an incident has happened, and we get all their different perspectives from it. So you can kind of think of it as like Rashomon the series. It's also become the series. It's also become a bit of like a joke at times in pop culture. The most popular one is, of course, there's an episode of The Simpsons where they go to Japan, and Marge comments to Homer, "It's like, oh, you love Japan. You loved Rashomon." And he says, "Well, that's not how I remember it." The remembering in perspective, the little in joke there. So Rashomon was kind of like his first big deal of a film to come out there. And since then, Kurosawa's films became more widely recognized and they became more prolific. He did a lot of samurai epics, but the one film that a lot of people forget, some people forget, however, that Kurosawa's work expanded toward more than just samurai films. The samurai films are inspirational, but he also did a lot of like modern dramas that are actually very effective. One of his best ones by far, I think most people can agree, is Ikaru. And this is basically the story of Mr. Watanabe, who's an elderly guy. He's worked in an office all his life, and he just realized that he has terminal cancer. And realizing this, he tries to realize that his days are numbered. He tries to find some meaning in his life and tries to do the right thing and struggles to find, how he can become less selfish and be like the person that he always wanted to be. There's a great moment, one of the more unforgettable moments in the film, where Mr. Watanabe is just chilling in a bar. He's hanging out with someone else who's like, trying to get him into the partying spirit. And there's someone playing the piano taking requests. And Mr. Watanabe requests this very, very somber song to be played on the piano. And he's the only one singing it in the bar, and everyone stops drinking to take notice of it because like his singing is not good, like he's singing it pretty terribly, but he's singing it well while he's on like the verge of tears because he realizes that it's a song about how, fleeting life can be, especially since this is a very old and nostalgic song for him, that it really just it pierces him, and you can feel it kind of like pierce everyone around him with just like, how much that song means to him. So yeah, that's one of his like less action packed films that's more highly regarded. But in terms of his more influential stuff, the biggest inspiration is by far one of the films that people consider his best work, which is The Seven Samurai. It's the story of a collective of samurai who are gathered together to help defend a village from bandits who are laying siege to it. And so a collective of samurai who are fairly reluctant to it, they're kind of hired for the job. They take on the job and realize that, that there's more to this village worth saving and that they got to put themselves ahead of others. Now, if this story sounds familiar, it's because it eventually inspired the Magnificent Seven, one of the best westerns of all time, with the greatest ensembles ever made. It's essentially the same story, except instead of samurai, it's cowboys. So like seven cowboys come together and they defend a town, from bandits. Same deal. Um, but I love how like influential it works, and it's not even like like a tertiary thing. Like it's kind of similar. Like if you watch The Magnificent Seven, it says right in the credits based on Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, obviously. So like Seven Samurai is definitely one of his longer films. It runs well over 3 hours, but it's you get to spend a lot of time with the characters. You get to understand them. You have probably one of the best performances by Toshiro Mifune, who just recently had his birthday on April 1st. So if you need a reason to go back and watch, consider that one of them. Mifune, of course, has been in a lot of Kurosawa films, probably one of his biggest stars in them. Because like right after that, right after Seven Samurai, he went on to Yojimbo, in which he played a nameless Ronin who wanders into town. He has no master and he answers to nobody. And he realizes that this town is being laid siege by two rival gangs. And basically, the nameless Ronin just stirs up trouble by working for both gangs and then basically watching them crumble as like the deceit and distrust builds while he tries to profit off of it. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it eventually inspired the Western film A Fistful of Dollars, in which a nameless cowboy came to town and stirred up trouble with gangs. So more Western influence there. And then right after that, Mifune starred in kind of like a semi sequel to Yojimbo and less of a grittier version, more of a comical take on that type of story, which was Sanjuro. And Sanjuro found Mifune playing a more ridiculous character who wanders into town, and he basically tries to help out some young warriors basically take out the trash, get out the evils of their town, and help them out. So it's kind of like a weird inverse. It's like Yojimbo's the gritty version, and Sanjuro's the more um, kind of heroic version. So you have hero and anti-hero. It because they're such like a pair, they often get paired together. Like in the Criterion, you can buy them in like the same set because they go hand in hand so great together. Another big inspiration was the film of the Hidden Fortress. The Hidden Fortress actually didn't inspire a western so much as it inspired a sci-fi film. So the story follows two Japanese peasants, Maratishi and Tahe, who are basically guys who basically go with the flow. If there's an attacking army, they want to be on the winning side, but when that doesn't turn out to be the case, they find themselves running away from war and deserting their posts. And because they run away, they actually end up running into a hidden princess who's being protected by a warrior, who of course is played by Toshiro Mifune. That's his role in life, playing like the gritty, no nonsense samurai. And so they realize they got to protect this princess, from forces that want her dead and basically keep her secret that they're being kept hidden in this mountain. And if this sounds familiar, if you can guess here, it inspired Star Wars. And mostly because like yeah, the peasants are supposed to represent the C3PO and R2D2, especially like in their bickering in the moments when they're wandering through the desert, realizing they don't really have a place and they're fugitives. It involves a princess and a warrior who takes on the hordes of armies. And yeah, again, like this is kind of like a more like constantly cited reference. Like George Lucas has brought this up many times that the Hidden Fortress was a huge inspiration for Star Wars, as with a lot of like westerns and sci-fi serials and all that. So it all comes around. There's always inspiration that comes about with it. Um, and when I mean that by that is that it all comes around because eventually after more of the this inspirational samurai stuff, um, Kurosawa's films would take inspiration from more classical works. Like he did a ransom film called High and Low, which was based on a detective novel called King's Ransom. He would later do Throne of Blood, which is probably one of Toshiro Mifune's more violent films. If you'll recall, this is the film where he basically gets stabbed with arrows constantly and is running about while arrows are constantly being shot at his palace. And what I love about that scene so much is because he's wandering around with arrows, but the arrows they're shooting towards him that are supposed to just hit the wall and not him are real arrows that are piercing there. So if he was just like a few inches off, he would have been like really injured by this stuff. And Throne of Blood was, of course, based on Macbeth. And then there's lots more inspirations here. Stuff like Ran is obviously based on King Lear. Ran is probably one of his most gorgeous films from the 80s. Just very vibrant color, and just amazingly epic scenes of just tons and tons of soldiers and armies and fire and swordplay and arrows flying. It's just one of his better epics that is worth checking out. Another one of his films that's more stylish with color is Kagemusha. And Kagemusha was a film that came out around like 1980. And this was another film that kind of like revived a lot of like international interest. Like George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, realizing that man, we owe so much to Kurosawa. They decided to like hold up Kagemusha and become like executive producers of getting the film over to the States. Kagemusha, for those who haven't seen it, is basically a king is targeted by his rivals, and a sort of bandit is chosen to assume the identity of the king and basically mimic all to basically fulfill the role of a king, even though he's not really well suited to it. It's got some great fight sequences. I love the kind of like almost kind of like anti-climax when they get up to the final fight scene. But I also love just like the visuals of it. There's a fantastic dream sequence where he has this kind of nightmare that seems to take place in like a painting where like he's by a lake that's like an almost kind of like tie-dye-ish color, and the sky is just like a mess of like crimson and different like bright colors that don't seem to be of this world, and just has this weird nightmare. Even outside of like the dream sequences, like a lot of the showdowns on the battlefield, especially ones that take place at night, have like this darker like a crimson tinge to them, which are just they're just fantastic to look at. It kind of echoes a little bit. There's a great horror film from around that same era called Kwaidan, which also used that's very like kind of bold depiction of like the sky being just like kind of like a picturesque painting of different colors. So there's a lot of cool filmmaking going on during that time in Japan. Let's see. Oh, you didn't notice that Jonah Beth? Yeah. It's one of those things where you think about it, and you look at enough in the material, you kind of get it. Um, so with Kurosawa, when he got later towards the end of his career, he started doing a few more notable stuff. Like one of like his second to last film was Dreams, which was kind of like it's weird because like his last films kind of echo the way that kind of like Miyazaki wanted to go out with something like The Wind Rises by making very personal films that he feels like he could only make at like the end of his career. So like Dreams was kind of like a magical realist type film, which was based on like all of like Kurosawa's thoughts and like ideas from different dreams he's had, and it involved like a lot of big names were involved with it, like Richard Gere stars in it. Martin Scorsese played a role in making this film happen. So that was kind of like his more like internationally like bigger known film towards the end of his career. But one of the more personal films that he ended his career on was Maradeo, which roughly translates to not yet, which is the story of a Japanese teacher slash author who was just coming to retirement and the end of his life around like the 1970s. Well, actually, towards the early 1970s, I believe, around that time. And it's just mainly just this old guy relating to his students and just trying to find a decent life at the end there. So it's a pretty nice note to leave Kurosawa on. Especially like with him and like Mifune, a lot of projects he's been on with Mifune. So all their work is fantastic. Definitely, like I mean, I have like certain films I like more than others. I think some of his early stuff is kind of hit or miss with stuff like Scandal and I forgot what the laughing one was called, but yeah, it's kind of hit or miss. But all of his films, definitely check them out if you can. Mm-hmm. Just for reference, if anyone wants to check out a lot of these films and aren't quite sure where to find them, you can buy like a lot of them are in the Criterion collection that you can still find. And if you want a streaming service to watch them on, there some of them are over on HBO Max, and a lot of more of them will be over on the Criterion Collection streaming service. Um, so thankfully, you can check them out there. Like now that we have streaming service, it used to be if I wanted to recommend this stuff, I'd say, well, save up your money and wait for the Criterion flash sale. But now it's a little bit easier to come across. So let's talk about like Kurosawa's a bit more like the prestige of the of Japanese cinema. So why don't we talk about like the more chaotic? So let's talk about the warped films of Koreyoshi Kurahara. So uh, Kurohara's stuff was mainly more pronounced within like the 1960s. He made a lot of early 1960s films that were very like against the grain, kind of kind of like a mix of both being like gritty gangster pictures and also like Japanese new wave. Mainly because they were all films that depicted a sort of like rebelliousness and just depicted just bad characters doing really horrible stuff and just showing like a youth that was just so angry and rampant and had all this energy and just didn't know where to put it. Like some of his films were like fairly typical of the era, like Intimidation is like a simple blackmail story about a bank manager just trying to get ahead and he has to stage a robbery of his own. But then you had more kind of like like rebel without a cause type stories, like the Warped Ones, which is just the story of a bunch of like scammers who take their revenge on journalists, and they're just horrible people, and just their lives turn into just messes the further that they go. They steal cars, they beat up on people, they steal from people, they hold them at gunpoint, they get involved with gangs. They're just they're just very unlikable people. So and like and they're like savage throughout these films. Like they will just like anytime they like steal a car, they will like resort to like howling and hooping and hollering and just making all sorts of like weird sounds with their mouths. So it's just like crazy stuff. One of his more notable works, which I found kind of interesting, for like the kind of like the odd perceptions that the youth had of certain culture, was the film Black Sun. Now, Black Sun is very much a controversial film because it involves this kind of like this rebellious kid, Tensei Kono. Well, no, wait. Tensei Kono was the story it's based on. The actual actor is Tamio Kawachi. And he basically lives a life of just like rebelliousness. He steals cars, but he's really into jazz. Like the one thing he loves more than anything is jazz records. He loves listening to it. He loves hanging out in jazz bars, which were a big thing at the time. So it's all he can think about. And then like he loves jazz so much that he loves like the notable black jazz black jazz singers and trumpet players and saxophone players. He just obsessed with them so much. And then one day, into his life, into his like little squatter home that he's residing in walks a black GI who's played by Chico Laurent. And Chico comes in there and he's basically wounded. He's angry. He wants to find a way out of the country. He's clearly a fugitive. And Tamio's character is basically like, oh man, a black guy, you must really know a lot about jazz. And because like he can't speak English, he keeps talking about jazz. And Chico is just, he's talking in English the whole time, just like, just shut up, get me out of the country, I'm wounded, I want to get out of here. And then Tamio quickly realizes that, he thinks he's, like big into jazz and, a big supporter of black people, but then he later realizes that he's actually racist because, he's a jerk. So it really questions his perception of having this rebellious obsession with jazz, but not really understanding, the different kinds of people, and only having this small mindset of, a certain group of people. And it's also worth noting that Chico Laurent has actually starred in like quite a few, like not just like he's been in like a few other Kurohara films, but a few other Japanese films at that time. Just because he was like, he was an actor who could speak English. So if you needed like an American role, he could come into your productions, just speak English. Although it is a little bit hard to understand him in Black Sun because most of the time he's in desperation and he's like struggling to breathe, and he's like very fearful and just horrified by the world, that he's screaming most of his lines. So he's either screaming them or they're kind of like grunty ones, like or like grunting his lines. So like when he's wounded and holding Tamio at gunpoint, he's not just saying shut up, he's saying like shut up, like he can barely get the words out. So there's a lot of times where I wish like the subtitles would fill in for him as well, so that I could understand, because a lot of his lines are just kind of just screamed and shouted out where you can barely understand them. So but I found it to be a very interesting perspective of how, like, certain Japanese youth have this very different perception, of the world, and the perception of race at the time. Like this film came out in the very early '60s, so it was a bit of like a controversial film to have out at the time. And then like Kurosawa stuff has been all over the map. Like he's done like like gangster pictures. He's done like unorthodox kind of like erotic films, like just all over the map. Just bizarre, warped films that are very very chaotically shot too. Like they like the jazz that he puts in a lot of these films are very fast, very the editing is like really quick between everything. A lot of times when characters are being chased down the street, we're just like dashing and the handheld cameras just shaking all over the place. So yeah, very typical like Japanese new wave type stuff. So to bring things down a little bit from the more warped Kurohara stuff, let's talk about one of my second favorite directors, which is Yasujiro Ozu. Now Ozu's kind of one of the more veteran filmmakers, mainly because he was making films around the silent era, and a lot of them have held up over time. And a lot of those films, which was fairly common at the time, that he remade them as time went on. One of his more classic, he's done like a bunch of different silent films too, like comedies and crime thrillers. One of his coming of age comedies is I Was Born But. Um, and this was like a whole series of films too. Like he did one about going through school, which is called like I Failed But. Um, and he actually remade these films later, and when he when it wasn't in the silent era, and when he had access to to make films with voice and with color. So like I Was Born But eventually became the film Good Morning. And Good Morning, I actually have it over on my shelf right there, Great Criterion Release. Good Morning is one of those wonderful films that I love to recommend, just because it's such a charming film for seeming so childish, but again, it's about children. So the whole idea is that two boys in 1950s Japan basically want their parents to buy them a television set so that they can watch wrestling on television instead of listening to the radio. And because their parents won't do this, they decide to go on a they decide to have a vow of silence until their parents will do it for them. So they don't talk to their parents, they don't talk to anyone, they remain silent throughout, and there's this questioning of communication. But at the same time, these boys are obsessed with farting. So they spend a lot of time like comparing how they fart and how they communicate with each other as they fart. And it sounds so bizarre, like it sounds like it's like a gross out type thing, but it's actually pretty sweet. Like when I say like they fart, these are like the cutest farts you've ever heard in your life. Like they don't sound like farts. Like when I initially watched the film, I thought, well, wait a minute, what are they doing? Like they're just standing there and they're wincing, and you hear this little like squeak. It's like, what are they doing? Are they like, is that like, are they winking? It's like, and then it took me like a minute to figure out. Oh wait, they're farting. So they're trying to make this like the cutest fart film ever made, and I gotta admit they kind of pulled it off. Like it's a really sweet film, a very like slice of life, the Japanese film that really has some interesting stuff to say about communication amid boys that are farting. So, especially when you consider that like the climactic shot of the film is one of them farting too much that it ruins their pants. So it's a bizarre film to recommend. Just trust me on this. It's a sweet film. It's the sweetest film you'll ever see about farts. The good news is though, that's probably one of the only Ozu films that I could think of that's like the weirdest one, because a lot of his other films are just fairly simple, sweet slice of life stories. Films like Tokyo Story, where there's an elderly couple who who feel like the world has passed them by and that their parents don't have that their children don't have time for them anymore, and that they kind of have to just slowly exit the picture. It's kind of similar to like a remake of this classic 30s film called Make Way for Tomorrow, where another elderly couple realize that their family doesn't have time for them anymore, and they kind of gotta, um, you know, tragically just step away from the spotlight and out of their lives. So, like, if you've seen that film and it makes you cry, like Tokyo Story will do the same thing. One of my favorite films from Ozu is by far Floating Weeds. Floating Weeds is one of like his like late stage films where like they were in color and they had voice, where a Japanese troupe, a troupe of actors come to town for a performance, and one of their leading actors just happens to have a son that they didn't realize they had with one of their lovers, and he basically tries to find a way to reconnect, but it doesn't really go so well. What I love so much about this film is that it kind of brings up a lot of the great stuff that Ozu would do and how he frames his films. So typically within his like slice of life stuff, Ozu will always have this kind of direct framing method. Like like for instance, whenever like we see characters walk about the house, we get like the like a kind of like a long shot where we can see everything that's going on. And then when there's dialogue happening where a character is talking to another character, typically that character will get like a close up and they will be looking directly into the camera. And you see this a lot in Floating Weeds. Whenever a character is talking, they're talking directly into the camera, directly at you. So it feels like you're more engaged with like the conversation that's going on here. And it's such a direct approach that I think it brings this very like kind of like dynamic nature to like films that could seem so simple, that they wouldn't be as engaging for like for as much drama as that they would have. But just the staging of it, the way he stages it is beautiful, and his choices of colors, especially in Floating Weeds, is just so bold and pronounced. Ozu kind of perfected this method of kind of like having what are known as pillow shots. So pillow shots are basically you can think of them like breathing room, and you see pillow shots all the time in anime as a little bit of like a time saver. So it's a fairly common technique. So basically, you would have like characters would be talking with each other indoors. They'd be having a good conversation, and then like the camera would either pan out or the camera would cut to something happening outside. Like we might focus in on like a puddle where raindrops are coming down. And then we'd come back inside, and then we'd have like another conversation with characters would be talking, about like a relationship or marriage. And then it would go back outside and we'd look at like some clouds or just like a telephone pole or just something like that. And then come back inside. So anime does this a lot, and Ozu films are rather notorious for having these different shots. But they're so immaculate and floating weeds because the color's so bold. Like we go outside and we see the cherry blossoms, and they're like this wonderful shade of pink. And then like there's a great scene where it's shot during where it's raining outside, and these two characters are between houses having a conversation with each other with the rain in between them. And what stands out is there's actually a red umbrella right in the corner, and it draws your eye and it makes the scene like pop, just like a little bit more bold, and you kind of like take notice of it. And it's really interesting to look at these techniques that make the colors so bold in here because like color correcting techniques during that time are not as like easy to do as we have them now, or like you can go in digitally, you can play around with some settings, and you can like tweak some lighting here and there within like films this far back, like in like the 50s and 60s. You had to get like creative with how you would shoot stuff, how you could light stuff, and a lot of just Ozu's work just looks so bold. Now, of course, yeah, with like remasterings and DVDs, it's a little bit easier to bring out that color, but the fact that it's there and it's like and it sticks out so well, you just stand up and pay attention to it. So these seemingly like slice of life films that would seem so boring actually have like a lot to them. So he did like a whole series of them. Like there's also like kind of like a series kind of like of like summer type films. So there'd be films like End of Summer, and this last film, an Autumn Afternoon, and just very easy, free flowing titles like that. So if you ever just want to feel good about life and just want something, well, he makes very cozy films, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like it always feels like his films have this real sense of humanity to them. So if you ever just kind of want like a feel good film, Ozu, I won't say all Ozu films are like that because some of them do involve tragedy, but they're definitely the most kind of like they're the Japanese films that have the most humanity, I would say. So I always like putting them on. All right. So now I'm going to talk about one of my favorite Japanese directors who often gets overlooked, which is Juzo Itami. Now, Juzo Itami kind of rose up as an actor, um, and then eventually Juzo Itami got into directing. And he directed one of my favorite films ever made, my favorite Japanese film by far, which is Tampopo. Tampopo was a film that was labeled as a ramen western, as kind of a joking title. Like you've heard of like spaghetti westerns. Well, it's a ramen western. It's a western that takes place in Japan, and it's kind of a joking title because the story actually does involve ramen. So basically, two Japanese milk truck drivers called Goro and Gun. Goro is played by Tutsumo Yamazaki, and Gun is actually played by a very, very young, just starting out Ken Watanabe. So it was very fascinating to see. Like Ken Watanabe, you'll probably know from stuff like Godzilla King of the Monsters and Last Samurai. He's been around the block. Most people will know who he is. So they basically arrive in town in Tokyo, and they stop by this ramen restaurant run by a single mother by the name of Tampopo. And Tampopo really struggles to make her restaurant work, and it's just not happening. So the truck drivers decide, you know what? Why don't we stay here and help her? We'll help her, become a great cook and run a good business, and we'll make her passionate about making ramen again. Like, and apparently they know like a lot of cool people around town. Like they know like those who have been in the business for a while, who know how to make the perfect ramen, as well as coming across unlikely allies who are skilled in like making restaurants work. But here's the thing: that's a great story, and I love it. But what makes the film work so well is that oftentimes the film will veer off into these vignettes that all center around food to some degree. Like we'll start off with like the ramen story, but then eventually you'll see that the camera will tilt away and it will go to this other restaurant where we follow the story about Japanese women learning how to eat spaghetti and all of them just slurping it. And then we'll go to another comedic sequence where there's a business meeting and everybody is ordering the same thing that the boss does, except for one intern who just orders everything off the menu and just pisses off his superiors. And there's all these like bizarre little stories that they go into. One of them's a ghost story about a woman who comes back from the dead just to make her family one last meal. One's a very silent type of comedy where this old woman goes around a grocery store just touching all the food, and the store owner has to stop her in this kind of like cat and mouse game. And there's all these just funny asides that just keep coming up, and then they keep coming back to like the restaurant story. So in the same sense of like there's pillow shots, here there's almost kind of like um comedic pillow scenes that will just like diverge off from the main story and then come back. They're just little palate cleansers. Like here's a little like something between courses to kind of like keep you involved with the story. It's just a wonderful film. Like it makes you feel good about being passionate about a craft or something like that. And it's made, and what I love so much about Itami's direction is that this kind of carried into Itami's other films about people who are very passionate about a career or trying to find their way in contemporary Japan. Because like the next film that came after this was A Taxing Woman, in which it follows a tax investigator who has to investigate a mafia dealing that doesn't look right to her. And it seems like it could be more of an action thriller, but it's treated more as kind of like almost kind of like as like a screwball type comedy where she has to try to figure all this out while the mafia is scurrying around trying to hide everything, and she's always like one step behind, but it's getting closer and closer by the day. And then if you want something a little bit more Popo, there was another film called Supermarket Woman, in which there's a struggling small supermarket that's trying to fight off against this bigger this big box store basically called it gets translated different ways, but the translation I saw, it's called uh, Discount Demon is the name of the big box store, and the small supermarket is called just Honest Mart. So so it's the battle of Honest Mart versus Discount Demon. It's mainly about this one woman coming in and helping out a supermarket manager, basically run a better store. Find stuff that doesn't work, find better ways to make the food, find better discounts, and try to research stuff and be passionate about it. So it's a lot like the typical like salary man type stuff where it shows people who are very engaged with their work and take this sort of like eccentric um uh, engagement with their craft. Like there's a lot of sequences in Supermarket Woman that are so like they're so silly, but they take them earnestly. Like there's a sequence where they realize they posted the wrong price for eggs, and the eggs they were going to have that day were so cheap that everyone in town would be coming to buy them. So realizing this, they order all these eggs at the last minute, and there's this kind of like suspenseful tone about whether or not they will get the eggs out on the floor. And they're kind of like rushing it out on carts. It's like an action film, like they got to get to it in time. And just the way that it's framed and the way that everyone takes it seriously, it's kind of one of those like tongue-in-cheek comedies. So they're just like inspirational films. Like Tampopo inspires you to, if it doesn't inspire you to get up and do something, it will inspire you to get ramen. I've I watched this film in the theater for my birthday one time, and it was the best experience. And I realized I had to get ramen after that because it was such a inspirational film. So yeah, it's one of those like it's one of like my favorite Japanese comedies, like Tampopo and Supermarket Woman. A Taxing Woman a little bit. It's a little bit drier. There is a sequel called like A Taxing Woman Returns, which is a little bit better. It's a little bit more of the same. So yeah, there's like Tommy didn't make too many films, but those few films are some of like my favorite ever made. So let's see. Let me take a drink here. Mm. Oh God, wearing out my voice today. Fifth panel of the day. All right. So love to recommend. You recommended that in a panel years and years ago. Yes, I keep recommending Tampopo. It finally got a Criterion release a few years ago, and actually you can kind of see it right behind me there on the shelf. Wonderful, wonderful film. Still holds up. Always love watching it. So let's talk more chaotic directors. Let's talk Seijun Suzuki. Seijun Suzuki probably does the more polarizing films that you'll find of the 60s and 70s. So he did a lot of gangster films. So basically Yakuza type films that rose to infamy, stuff like Take Aim at the Police Van, Fighting Elegy was a big one. And then a lot of films about like, like about like the streets, stuff like Gates of Flesh, which told the story of like prostitutes in post-war Tokyo. But then he did some more vibrant stuff that was kind of like out there and kind of daring. So he did stuff like Tokyo Drifter. I think most people would kind of agree that's one of his better films, which is basically about a yakuza boss who has dissolved a criminal empire, and then there's a bunch of rivals who basically won't let their loyalties go, and basically go on like a killing rampage. And it's stylishly shot. It's got very vibrant neon colors, and it's just there's like lots of assassinations, there's lots of showdowns, there's this cool edge to it where it switches between black and white and between color, and just the music is just jazzy and it gets you so involved. It's definitely one of my favorite films of his. Now his more notable film, to take into account, he did a film called Branded to Kill. um, and this is basically the story of a Japanese hitman who's who's kind of highly regarded within his craft, but then he becomes the target of another assassin, and he basically finds himself on the run. But now it sounds like a fairly simple Yakuza film, but the way it's staged is so bizarre. Like a lot of his kills are strange. Like if I remember this correctly, he does strange kills where he relies on like a billboard as his cover. At one point, he kills somebody through the plumbing, which is so bizarre. But what's even more bizarre is that he ends up hooking up with this mysterious woman who has this fascination with butterflies. And later, there's this strangeness involving a boxing ring and a bit of an odd showdown. And like the imagery is so strange. It's in black and white, and it's all over the place. And this film was so strange that the studio really did not like what Suzuki was doing with it. They thought, man, this is like new wave that's gone too far. It's too strange, it's too out there, it's like too abstract and esoteric. Nobody is going to understand this film. Change it, do something else. And Suzuki basically said no, and just kept the film as is and released it. And as a result, this actually, like, no joke, this got Suzuki banned from making films for 10 years. So Branded to Kill was the one film that like pushed Seijun Suzuki out of directing for a whole decade. Thankfully, he did actually return. He did direct a few more films before he passed away, including one film that a few people might know, which is the Lupin film, Legend of the Gold of Babylon, which he co-directed. So he directed a few films after that, but to be honest, none of them were quite as daring as like stuff like Gates of Flesh or Tokyo Drifter. But yeah, man, what man, to take a risk on a film that would just blacklist you from the industry, that's a director with some guts, you know. Um, so if you want to, so like now all these directors I've mentioned have been like fairly older, type from fairly older type films, the silent era, 50s, 60s. Juzo Otami was a little bit more the 80s. So let's talk about like some more notable modern directors you might know. So why not talk about one of the most interesting directors, which is Takeshi Takano, otherwise known as Beat Takeshi. So Beat Takeshi had a lot going for him. He was an actor. He was a comedian. Some people might know him from his incredibly hard NES video game, Takeshi's Challenge. But he actually rose to fame a little bit higher with his film Violent Cop. So there's a few conflicting sources on this, but so the story goes. Apparently, Violent Cop was going to be a comedy about about a cop who's investigating criminal activity, and he goes a little bit too far. But then they brought on Beat Takeshi, who stars in the film as well, to direct it, and he apparently took it in a much like darker direction. Like he made sure that his cop character wasn't just kind of the bad cop. They made sure he was like the baddest cop ever. Like he would break down doors, he would threaten teenagers, he would like beat them senseless, and just go over the edge. To the point where in the climax he ends up making kills that he regrets, but that he has to keep going with because he's that much of a detached police officer from society. So yeah, Violent Cop was just like it made you stand up and take notice. Like, damn, Kitano is just like one of those guys you don't want to mess with. And he made a name for himself after that. He kept directing these other gritty type films about cops gone too far or yakuza with stuff like Boiling Point. But he actually rose up into the more international spotlight when he did a great film called Sonatine. So Sonatine, I think, is one of Takeshi's like best films ever made. It's basically he plays a Japanese mobster who's kind of grown tired with the game. Like he is so bored with the mafia life. He's become so used to like shootouts and tortures and killing that he finds like no thrill in it, no fascination with it. It's just like another job that he goes through the motions of. Like at one point, he ends up drowning one of the people he's trying to interrogate, and he's just kind of like slightly interested in the fact that this guy would drown after so long. He just doesn't really take note of it. It's not until like his crime organization relocates to a beach where he finds himself like having a better time. Like he enjoys just playing silly games on the beach and just having general fun. And then when he gets more involved with the mafia stuff, with like shootouts and stuff like that, he takes no pleasure in it, none. At one point, he has this dream where he's playing Russian roulette on the beach, and then he kills himself, and he basically wakes up and he feels nothing. And it's clear that like he's not really attracted to like vice anymore. Like while he's on the beach, he saves a woman from being raped, and they connect. And later, there's a point where she has her shirt off in front of him, and it seems like this is going to be their romantic scene. But but Kitano doesn't really take much pleasure in that. He's just more like saying, "Hey, we it's fun to be nude, isn't it?" And that was about the extent of that scene. Later on, there's a scene where she's in a bikini and tries out firing his automatic weapon, which would seem like a thrill. Like, here's this woman trying out a gun. That would seem like fun, and he takes no pleasure in it. He is just straight faced, like, I I have no fun doing this. I would rather be, lighting off fireworks or just, having wrestling matches on the beach. Um, so he basically kind of has a death wish, and I like the fact that it never really comes for him. Like he's almost kind of hoping that he will die in the line of duty because there's so many opportunities for it. Like they bomb his building. They have unexpected assassination attempts that happen. He gets involved in a dangerous shootout, and he just keeps living and living and living, just hoping that one day, his life is going to end, and kind of realizes that it might not happen unless he wants it to happen. So it's a very somber type film that's just it shows like kind of like the emptiness of living that life of crime. One other thing to note about that too is that the film actually has a soundtrack, um, which is a fairly kind of like light, kind of like trying to find the word. I don't quite want to say like Miami Vice, but kind of like a light, eerie tone for a crime picture. With the soundtrack that was by Joe Hisaishi, who a lot of people will know does the soundtracks for the Ghibli films. So while he was doing that, he was also scoring a Yakuza film. Now, Sonatine is the more notable film because the studio felt that they were reluctant to push Sonatine to an international crowd. They're like, this is too much of a Japanese film. Nobody's going to get it. Nobody's going to care. But they pushed it out there anyway, and like a lot of people took notice of it. Film festivals held it up high. They were like, "Oh, this is great," because like Kitano stars in this film as the mobster and he directs it, and they're like, "Where's this Kitano been all this time? We love this guy. Where can we see more of his stuff?" And so after that, you started seeing Kitano become more prevalent in U.S. films as well. He's actually been in a few films with some supporting roles and stuff like I believe like Johnny Mnemonic, and you might recognize his most recent appearance was in the 2017 American adaptation of Ghost in the Shell. And what I like so much about his appearance in that film is that he's the only one who's speaking Japanese among like the Section 9 people, and like everyone else is speaking English. And it's just like, look, you let Kitano speak Japanese. Like he's that much of a badass. You don't question him. And he still gives like his great performance that we expect from him. And he still keeps making great films to this very day. He's made films like the Outrage trilogy, which is a series of Yakuza films with like Outrage, Beyond Outrage, and what's the Outrage? Outrage Coda. So uh, one of the best. One of the best. All right. So now let's talk about. We're coming close to the end of the panel, but I'll mention like one of my favorite crazy directors, which is Takashi Miike. So I'm sure a lot of people have been waiting for this. Takashi Miike makes the weirdest of the weird Japanese films ever made. Where you might be familiar with some of his work, like Audition is probably one of his most highly regarded films, which is a film about a TV producer who holds an audition to hire a woman for an acting gig, but really he's trying to hire a woman to be his girlfriend and wife to try to bring him out of his funk. But he doesn't realize that this woman is actually a bit of a serial killer, and she's going to torture him by putting needles in his eyes and chopping off his limbs too. So Audition is a really fascinating film because it's a film that fluctuates between like you're not quite sure whether it's a sexist film or if it's a feminist film, because like we showcase the producer as being a little bit of like a sleazy guy, and they show that he's a little bit like sexist and in his targeting of women, but then later he gets targeted by this woman who's a serial killer, gets her revenge on him, but the revenge is so sadistic that it makes you question how far is it going into being a revenge film, where if you're supposed to side with one side or another. It goes back and forth. I've read so many essays that can't quite decide on it, and I love that type of film where you're not quite sure of its complete meaning of it. So it's definitely worth rewatching if you can stand the torture scenes, which are very hard to watch. But McKay is best known for films that are just bizarre and will just have odd twists in them. Like for instance, he did a film called Dead or Alive, which seems like a standard Yakuza film. Like it's just like one detective trying to chase after this Yakuza running about town. It's a very like action heavy film. There's lots of fast cutting and loud rock and roll music and drugs and crazy kills all over the place. One person gets her hand stuck in a deep fryer at one point and gets it shot off. So it's a pretty good film. But then you get to the end. And at the end of the film, the lead detective and the lead Yakuza, they have a shootout. They shoot each other, they fill each other with holes, and they stand there for a moment, and they start falling down. But before they do, they stop. And they stop themselves from falling. And then, no joke, and a lot of people don't believe me when I tell them this, but I swear this in the film. The detective pulls out a bazooka just from behind his back, and the Yakuza forms like a key energy ball that you would see on like Dragon Ball Z. And the detective fires the bazooka, and the Yakuza throws the key ball, and there's a huge explosion that encompasses the earth. And nothing in the film has led up to this point, and you're just left like, what just happened in like the last minute of this film? And the best thing about Dead or Alive is that there were two more films after it. So you can find out what happens next and how all this craziness happened. McKay films have always pushed the boundary too. Like Visitor Q is a film that's been banned in several countries for a number of reasons. It's a film about a family that is visited by a stranger, and his presence basically inspires them to commit necrophilia and other stuff involving body parts and bodily fluids. And yeah, this film got banned in several countries. And the fact that we actually released it over here was quite amazing. Of course, he did Ichi the Killer, which is one of his more highly regarded, crazier Yakuza films. Just the story of Ichi, this tragic sadist who goes around killing people as a hitman, and Kakihara, a masochistic Yakuza who's seeking someone who can kick his ass properly and deliver pain. And wow, does Kakihara loves pain. He loves like in order to show his allegiance to people, he will cut off his tongue in front of it and give it to people. What I found interesting about Ichi the Killer is that I had watched the R-rated cut when it came out, and I thought that was like the uncut version. And I noticed that wow, there's no actual title sequence in this film. Like I found that odd. And then later I found out, oh, there's an uncut version of this film. So I went and bought the uncut version and I watched it, and then I realized why the R-rated cut doesn't have a title sequence. And it's mainly because the title sequence forms out of a fluid. And so it's bizarre. I've never seen like an edited version of a film where they had to take out the title sequence because it was that grotesque. Um, but yeah, it was bizarre to see that film. It has over the top sequences, like CGI blood, characters who are muscle bound who don't seem like they would be, uh, ridiculous kills, over the top blood and gore everywhere, and just a generally bizarre and lovable film. So to say it right, yeah. And like over time, Ichi the Killer has been more highly regarded just because it's such a gonzo film. He's also he's like Miike's films are just like the definition of like the over the top Japanese films. Stuff like Happiness of the Katakuris, which is a film about a family who runs an inn that murders people, and it's a musical comedy. So there you go. He directed a small segment for the horror anthology Three Extremes, the short Sisters. But what I found really interesting was that he actually made a film for the Showtime Masters of Horror series. So for those who aren't familiar, there was a series on Showtime called Masters of Horror, and each episode would be a feature-length horror film from a notable horror director who's done like some work. So they tapped Miike. They said, Miike, you gotta do a film for Showtime. And they said, like, look, it's Showtime. You can do whatever you want. It's not bound by the same TV logic. You can push the boundaries. And he made this film about that involved a prostitute and like this kind of like existential horror involving abortions. And Showtime looked at this film that he titled Imprint and looked at it and said, we cannot air this. What's really like, look, we're Showtime, but we're not going to go that far. So Imprint was eventually released, but not under the Masters of Horror series. Like that's how far Miike will go. He will push boundaries so far. Like I said, Visitor Q has been banned in several countries, and Imprint couldn't be shown on Showtime. So that should give you an idea. And he still continues to make great films to this day. He made a film 2 years ago called First Love, which is just a neon bizarre love story of like organized crime and drug dealing and all sorts of assassinations and stuff. It's just another giddy romp from him. I didn't have time to mention it to you, but another actor I love is Seijun Sano. He's done films. He did a film called Suicide Club, which didn't really resonate with me. I thought it was too weird and didn't really do much of the material. But then he did a film that I absolutely loved that won me back, which was Why Don't You Go Play in Hell, which is about a turf war between Yakuza and filmmakers who basically want to film all of like the shootout and the carnage while it's going on. And like they'll stop the shootout. So it's to say like, look, can we get audio here? Can we get a cut here? Very kind of like gonzo filmmaking type stuff that is so bizarre and so fun. So yeah, so let's see. I'll take a look at the chat here. Oh yeah, you mentioned Gozu. The Bird People of China is another great one. A little bit more whimsical. I found that one, and then of course 13 Assassins, which is great. Oh, yeah, I will mention Shin Godzilla for a moment because someone mentioned that here. Shin Godzilla, I think, is the best Godzilla film made in a long, long time. Just because I love the fact that Godzilla takes shape over the course of the film, so you have like a different portrayal of him. But what I love even more is the human story of the bureaucracy that goes into fighting Godzilla, which has this wonderful satirical edge to it that you don't see. Like generally the human story tends to be boring. Humans will sit around, they'll talk about how to deal with Godzilla, or he's going to do this, and this is how he was, this is the other monster, blah blah blah, the same stuff. But I love the fact that there's all this bureaucracy where it feels more like a salary man type story, with like the government red tape that goes into handling Godzilla. So yeah, that's definitely, I love that way more than the American takes we've done with Godzilla, which have been okay, but it feels like Shin Godzilla has way more to say than I think any Godzilla film has in the last like decade or so. So yeah, I absolutely love Shin Godzilla. All right, well, Wow, it seems like we blew through that really quick. So I'll end the panel by just saying, if you want to read more of my stuff, you can check out movieswithmark.com. I've also got books for sale on Amazon. You can check out me. I'm on Twitch. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Twitter. You can find all that information at movieswithmark.com. So thank you all for coming out this wonderful panel, and I hope that you will seek out some of these films if you've never heard them before, and just further explore just all the wonders that Japanese cinema has to offer. So thanks for stopping by.